Okay, hello everyone. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm very pleased that I can share my own intervention here, the thing that I have been doing since 2016, looking at a specific unique community in Indonesia called the Indonesian migrant worker. Statistically, officially, there are around 1.2 million Indonesian working overseas, but there's the registered one, but there are more, and majority of them are women. With the rise of ISIS in 2015, we are seeing a unique way of people joining. In the past, people have to join a specific group first, what we call it collective actions. The existing group will be Jamaah Islamiyah, or non-JI, or in Indonesia, hardcore supporter of ISIS will be Ansaruddaullah. People have to join that group first, and then they get involved in a specific terrorist activity directed or encouraged by people in the group. But since 2014, we are seeing shifting where people, you don't have to join, but you just connect with an idea through online. So with this kind of a phenomenon, we are seeing a number of Indonesian workers who radicalized online without meeting the actual persons. So seeing that phenomenon, I have been trying to introduce a narrative-based intervention for migrant worker, because as I said earlier, the background is they manipulate, they hijack, they manipulate what I call it master narrative to alert potential recruit, including Indonesian farmer worker. What I mean by master narrative is a narrative that is that has been widely believed to be true and trustable within a specific context. In this study, the master narrative that often used by the violent group is usually taken from the Quran, Hadith, or Islamic history, and this narrative are recognizable. And then there is the master narrative, and then we are seeing what I call it as a group narrative, where the group interpreted or reframing for their own vested interests, and then the one that I'm interested will be the what I call it micro narrative, the subjective interpretation of specific individuals. In the case of migrant worker, usually they interpret through they learn those tag the religious narrative through social media. This is one of the cases. In my presentation, this is one of my source. A woman called Listiawati from Kendal, from Central Java, working as a migrant worker in Hong Kong. She was radicalized online and donate money, and then made appointment with a with the offline ISIS supporter. Next. So this is one of my This is when the female terrorist is a new phenomenon in Indonesia that emerged along ISIS supporter, because in the past where JI also use women, but they are not involved directly in the actions, and this is what so the rise of ISIS changed the whole landscape. This is one of the migrant worker from Hong Kong. She radiated herself to be a suicide bomber for Bali bombing, for Bali, and then she was thrown into the network simply because of social media, with the narrative of redemption. She was involved in LGBT community, involved in number of fights, according to her. So coming from poor family, coming from poor family in Central Java, and then went to Malaysia briefly, then to Taiwan. It was in Hong Kong. It was in Hong Kong. She started to have a cultural shock working for non-Muslims, but very nice one. But she didn't have enough time. She didn't really work very hard, because she said in the interview, the house is small, I don't need to work hard. So then she spent most of her time online. So it was through that online she started to click here, click there, specific websites and information released by the group, and through this echo chamber of online radicalization, she was trapped in the rabbit hole of radicalizations. And if we look at literature, There are many reasons behind why a person become a terrorist, such as family factors, the social environment, religion, being born in refugee camp, imprisonment, feeling a victim, desiring to be a hero, feeling hate and anger. This is one of my source also, Aulia. She reached out to me through my community website, and while she is in Syrian camp, surrounded by all those ISIS supporter, ISIS, those many radicalized online. You see Rahmah, you see Huda from Canada, US, Kimberly from Canada. So they become a new kind of a a club among this individual, and women are drawn reluctantly into terrorism and are motivated by personal or private reasons. This is all the literature say. They may be motivated by revenge, redemption, respect, and relationship. It was stated that the loss of loved one and inability to conceive children or being considered not marriable were considered as the reason being a female terrorist. Based on and because of that one, so the research question for my intervention will be, how do we use PCVE narrative based intervention to a specific cluster of community of Indonesian migrant worker? So this is one of my engagement with Indonesian worker in here in Singapore, and I propose to understand this phenomena. I think I borrow from the framework coming from mostly from gender studies. There's a notion of but because intersectionality approach, how multiple identities interact to create unique pattern of perceived or real oppressions. Because when we end up feeling, so one of the characteristics of being a diaspora will be a feeling of alienation that stem from the belief that they cannot, or at least fully accepted by their new homeland. So, and then they found home, not because they do not find home in their faraway land, but they found home in social media. And that social media, the connective notion of being a social media, they are part of imagine community, and then become imagine solidarity. And then this is example of good practices that I have been doing. So I promote, I have a program called Promoting Positive Narrative Through Credible Voice. I understand that I cannot, because in any communication, narrative intervention, you have to understand your position. I fully agree. I'm a man and I'm coming from kind of okay middle, I don't know whether middle class, but comfortable life in Singapore. So talking to this migrant worker will create power relation, unbalanced power relations. So I work closely with Unaesah. He is a former migrant worker in Hong Kong, who is now an award-winning documentary filmmaker. He's part of my team in Ruang Ngobrol. I work closely with her, and then we publish a film among migrant workers themselves, because I believe we need to empower them. So this is one of the example of the film that we produce.
Aku pernah punya pengalaman pahit gara-gara main medsos. Aku malah di penjara. Aku sempat berpikir, dosaku kan begitu banyak ya. Sampai macam-macam dosa sudah aku jalanin. Jadi ketika ibarat aku dikasih hidayah, ya aku mau total di situ. Akhirnya ya jatuh cinta juga aku sama daulah ini karena mereka menawarkan surga dengan cara cepat. Karena tertantang sebuah postingan di Facebook, ya aku bentuk tim untuk melakukan amalia itu. Tapi tim yang aku bentuk masih belajar, belum tahu cara membuat bom.
So we interview her also. I met her first time in 2018. We established good relationship. I continue to build relation with her. After release, she contacted me, and then I work closely with former migrant worker also, Mbak Unaesah, to interview her, so to share the story. And so our ongoing project, I'm now producing a book called The Deadly Narrative of Terrorism Finance, how the narrative among them, how they use narrative and social media to allure a potential recruit to donate the money. So it will coming out soon this year. And turning the book into 4 short film. This is one of the film because I use a credible voice here, life history. I'm very pleased here that my supervisor in St. Andrews is now here, but Mr. John Horgan. He doesn't like to be called my best professor. So film and forum, we have a credible voice where they share a story, share with them. So that is, I use the film as a way to spark the conversations. And that's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we'll have our next paper from Unaesah, Rahmah and Nawridho Dirwan, and the paper is Credible Voice, an Inhibitor or Catalyst of Radicalisation, the case of DeBintal in Indonesia.
Right. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you very much. So I will be presenting for 10 minutes, and then my colleague Nawridho will also be presenting from Zoom for another 10 minutes. So this is the title of our presentation today, as well as our research questions. So I think you heard from Huda, Ismail, and also Julie Shanaf Huang that they mentioned about, being engaged with a credible voice and the PCV initiatives. So I think our research want to know the role of, credible voice in the PCV initiative. The concept here that I use first is inhibitor and catalyst are actually taken from radicalizations and mobilization dynamic frameworks by NCCT in 2016. So in the framework, it mentioned that credible voice could be a factor as an inhibitor, which means can prevent or stall the progression of individuals committed to engage in violence. Whereas catalyst is defined as a factors that are enable or facilitate the mobilizations of individuals by physically or virtually providing the space and opportunity to take an action. So I think we want to understand this in the role of credible voice, sort of in the case of DeBintal in Indonesia. So this is only to give like some sort of general understanding on like the counterterrorism effort in Indonesia. So this is the categorizations that used by Habibie Foundation in 2019. So here in the apprehension, or it's called as penangkapan in Bahasa Indonesia, I highlighted in the blue color because in the recent research, it shows that, the apprehension, arresting and preventing terrorist attacks in Indonesia has been significantly improved, especially after the enactment of the new counterterrorism law in 2018. But the other parts, say the radicalizations and especially reintegrations, are still underdeveloped, lack of evaluation, risk assessment, comprehensive planning, consistent monitoring, and also continuity of the programs. So this one is like, on the concept of the credible voice itself. I think Dr. Huang mentioned just now first is on the experience. So usually the credible voice emphasis on in terms of the experience. Say the former terror offender is considered as credible voice because they have a unique experience. They have been through this radicalization process and also the radicalization process, and hence they have a very kind of unique rich knowledge in terms of how people can, become radicalized and also de-radicalized. And also credible voice sometimes in terms of representations. In the PCV programs, we also, consider like youth or women as a credible voice because it is kind of expected that these people, can understand the community, a part of the community better. And the most important characteristic is, the credible voice are perceived to have a greater influence to their targeted audience. I think Dr. Huang mentioned that, by engaging the former terror offender, they have a greater influence in terms of like convincing the terrorist inmates to leave the extremist ideology. So this is the case that we want to look at. It's called DeBintal. DeBintal Foundation is abbreviation from dekat bintang and langit. It means near the star and the sky. So DeBintal itself was established in 2020 in Bekasi. Bekasi is a city that outskirts of Jakarta. It engaged a former terror offender, but mostly from pro-ISIS members. So I think Dr. Huang mentioned more on like, the former of Jemaah Islamiyah, but this Yayasan DeBintal, they engage more on the pro-ISIS members. For example, like Jemaah Ansar Daulah, which is like a local pro-ISIS networks, and also Mujahidin Indonesia Timur, which is based in Poso, Sulawesi. Now they has almost 20 members. Their programs include preventions, which is like online intervention, engaging in a counter narrative, which I will explain. And my colleague Fines will explain more on their Safari Dakwah in the radicalization in prison and also integrations. So this DeBintal Foundation is heavily supervised by Detachment 88, our Indonesian counterterrorism task force, and it funded mainly by the 88 as well. They have been trying to kind of, have like self-funding initiative, but I think it has not been successful until now. So this is a proof that the foundation was officiated by a mayor of Bekasi, which is a city in Indonesia. Okay, so now we're moving into the online campaign of DeBintal. So in the online campaign, at least I saw like 4 kind of works that they are doing. First is the counter narrative activities. I think I know that now there are a lot of terms in terms of counter narrative. Maybe some people come up with alternative narrative, positive narrative, and others. But I think I would just like put it in the bracket of counter narrative. So the counter narrative, which I will explain later in details, mostly comes in the video format. They have also posting, audio, and so on, so on and so forth. And the next one is information. So this is also one of I believe an important part of the online campaign, because they sometimes posting their advertisement for like trainings and also workshop for like the former terror offenders, so they can join, and also for like the guest house, where say if the wife of terrorists want to visit their husband in the prison, where is like the nearest guest house that the wife of terrorists can stay or live and while they visiting their husband. And the third one is a conversation. So the DeBintal staff are quite active in engaging their online followers. So on the social media platforms, they receive quite a lot of comments, and the DeBintal staff are active in terms of like replying message, and they also even created account WhatsApp account, so that maybe some former terror offender who are not like say comfortable to engage them in social media platforms, so they can reach out to them in a WhatsApp account. And the last one is crowdfunding. So crowdfunding activities is actually kind of similar to what has been done by pro-IS groups, especially in Indonesia. They're doing a lot of like online crowdfunding through like Facebook pages. So now they're doing this crowdfunding by asking donations from like the public to support the wife of terrorist inmates. So this is like their YouTube channel. So they have Check Ombak channel. If you can see the logo, it's actually the logo is quite similar to the 88 logo, which is an owl. I think it's kind of like shows how like they are very closely linked to the 88. And also they have WhatsApp account, Instagram here, Facebook, and also Instagram. So this is a part of their counter narrative programs. So first, their counter narrative programs are focused on targeting the pro-IS supporters on Facebook, on social media platforms. So this here I mentioned about the group called Gulat, because in Indonesian social media platforms now, the pro-IS supporters are divided into like two camps. First is they call themselves as like Gulat extreme camps of pro-IS supporters, usually refer to those who still hold firmly to like the Takfiri ideology or excommunicating others Muslims. Another one is called Rinciun. So Rinciun is actually taken from Bahasa Indonesia, which means giving details. So these Rinciun camps, usually they are more lax in terms of interpreting the ISIS stance and justify their acts by providing detail or excuses. So Rinchun, usually they are okay by sending their children to like public schools, or okay if their members being a public kind of sovereign, which are not accepted by the Gulag. The next one, they engage ex-terror offenders and terrorist inmates to share their stories in the video format, and then they disseminated on the YouTube platforms, Facebook and Instagram, mainly focusing on the ideology changes. So say the story of the ex-terrorists or the terrorist inmates, kind of explain why they left the extremist ideology, and why now they're embracing some sort of like the true Islam, and why now they pledge allegiance back to the Indonesian Republic. And the third one, they feature high profiles or respected individuals from the militant groups, for example, like Aman Abdul Rahman. In the Indonesia context, a man called Aman Abdul Rahman was quite influential. Back in 2014 to 2016, we can see that his name was cited a lot in the Facebook forums, especially to justify, say, to killing the police, or for the Takfiri ideology. And also Abu Bakar Bashir and some other kind of high-profile militants. I think the reason why they engage these kind of respected and high-profile individuals was to attract more viewers. So videos that feature this, high-profile usually can up to like 9,000 viewers or even 1,000 in their YouTube video accounts. The next one is, I think it's quite interesting, because usually most of PCV initiatives try to disassociate themselves with the government, but DeBintal give some quite, I think, large portions, to build a really positive narrative for D88, especially saying, for example, through the convention of terrorist inmates and even ex-terrorists, how they've been treated nicely by the 88. I mean, I could understand, because police has been like the main target for like pro-ISIS supporters in Indonesia, but I think the content for the 88 are quite a lot in the DeBintal content narrative programs. So they I think they are kind of have like strong association with the government and the 88, and they show it very clearly in their social media platforms. And this one also, the next one is they are sometimes using insult remarks or sarcasm when they reply comments to the pro-ISIS supporters who also like comment to their posting. So it's kind of they kind of use some sarcasm each other. And the last one is their video and audio are still like in low quality. Sometimes it's blur, it's not clear. I think I want to highlight a point where we cannot just depend, this former terror offender just being they are credible voice, and hence they can some sort of produce some like good contents and yeah. So this is the reaction that I observed from like the social media platforms that they use. First is YouTube. So in YouTube, they have highest viewers for video content. I think the highest one I mentioned was the video of Aman Abdul Rahman, which can up to like 9,000 viewers. And I think since they posted video since November 2020, they have around like 290,000 viewers at least for video for YouTube account. I'm sorry. And the next one is, I think in the YouTube, the pattern that I saw as well, they have like, positive reaction. What I mean by positive reaction, usually the comments that are given in YouTube are like some sort of giving them support, that their, counter narrative is good, or saying, agreeing that, terrorist inmates should have, pledging allegiance back to Indonesia, and only few negative comments. And the next one, they also uploaded their contents in Instagram. It has like moderate to high viewers for video content, so it can up to like 1,000 viewers, but it has the least engagement with followers. And the last one is Facebook. Facebook is kind of social media platforms in which they have the highest negative comments. Negative comments by here saying that, a lot of pro-ISIS supporters that give a reply to their posting usually will excommunicate them or call them murtad in Arabic terms, and exposing the DeBintal staff kind of personal history. So one of the staffs called Hendo Fernando. So they kind of expose Hendo Fernando personal life, and also give like some threaten that they will attack DeBintal staff. But it has the highest engagement. So I think the highest engagement means that the Facebook content were seen or were viewed by pro-IS supporters, which is kind of good in a way that the content were seen by their targeted audience, but then it has kind of backlash response from the targeted audience. And the next one, why Facebook has like the highest kind of comments and engagement, because a lot of like pro-IS supporters in Indonesia, they will reposted DeBintal content on their Facebook account itself, or say they will take a screenshot from like YouTube and then circulate among themselves. I think especially on the video of Aman Abdurrahman and also Abu Bakar Bashir. So this is one of example of the negative comment that the pro-IS supporter has. I'm sorry, I didn't translate it to English, but I think one of the example here, it said, on a Kafeni, he said that, because one of the video that was disseminated by DeBintal feature Aman Abdurrahman encouraged people not to take a violent action in Indonesia land. So people reacted like they will just like not following Aman Abdurrahman. I will stick to the ISIS ideology. This is another one of giving some threat to Hendo Fernando, which is one of the DeBintal staff. And my colleague Venus will take on from this.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Unaesah. From now on, I'm continuing Unaesah part on my partner on the counter narrative, or is part of the prevention program of the DeBintal. So this finding we got from the DeBintal based on the interview. So we come to the DeBintal office and talk to the staffs about how they react to this counter narrative. So they claim, DeBintal claim that they put an extra work on the labil group they call, or the unstable or unsure group. This group is the like a wife or the families that still unsure whether they still want to stay in the network or release their pledge of allegiance because their husbands or their sons were captured and put in prison. So they were left behind, and then in the terms of confusion, they are unsure whether they want to stay in the group or not. This is that the DeBintal claim that they targeted put an extra work on this. And the counter narrative also not only to aim to radical network, but they also aim to their own people. So there are members of the DeBintal staff that also still unsure whether they make a correct decision by releasing the allegiance and state their allegiance to Indonesian government. And they claim that the transparency is the key. They are not hiding any information about who they are, and they say that they are former terrorist convicts as well, and they work closely with Detachment 88. Thus, this is what they say, that they are coming together and raising their confidence to each other. Next. Okay, so this is the online part. They also claim that the narrative is tailored specifically, intentionally to this label group, to the unsure group. They social media posts like in the Facebook or YouTube that they are put it on purpose. That is the topic that controversial to spark anger or the negative comment from the opposite side. Luckily, it works so far. The opposite side were very easy to be triggered, and they are very easy to mengkafirkan or labeling others as the infidels other than themselves. And this fight in the online space are confusing the unsure group or the label group. This group become more confused because when they come to the online space and the Facebook and they are seeing the comments and the chats, and they are confused which is the right one, which is the truth between these two groups, because they are very noisy and they're always fighting, and they're gibah or talking behind of each other, which is not really in line with Islamic teaching. So they are already confused about whether they steps, and they have become more confused because the DeBintal action and with their social media posts. Next. And then when they are on that stage, the DeBintal says that when they are already in the state of even more confusing, the DeBintal will find a way to reach them. And some of them, they also claim that even reach the DeBintal by themselves. They message them through the Facebook messengers, they message them through the WhatsApp group, and some of them are ready to talk to the DeBintal as well. And the DeBintal staffs, based on our interview, believe that this strategy is working because according to them, 70% of the social media visitors come from this label group. But sadly, they cannot provide any data until this point. So we just put it as a claim for this presentation. Okay, so
2 more minutes.
So our next part is the radicalization beside the prevention. The DeBintal also doing a safari dawah to prisons. They are targeting high-risk inmates in Nusa Kambangan, which is the high-risk prisons. They claim they have met 20 terrorist inmates since 2020, but they only talk to people, to the inmates that want to talk to them or willing to talk to them. But the weak point here is like they did not did this on regular basis. They did this on on-call basis when the detachment 88 requests their service, and then they will come. When the 88 did not ask, and they did not. And the tagline is, "We are here to talk. We are here to share our stories. We do not force. We do not try to manipulate you. We do not try to convince you." And they're also collaborating with the Jenpas, the Directorate General of Correction, to sometimes organize religious discussions in prisons as well. Next. And the other one is the reintegrations. The reintegration is part of the opportunities and jobs that they are challenging right now. So they say that they have a personal bond to the inmates that they are talking to Nusa Kambangan. And when those individuals come out from the prison, were released from prison, to make sure that those individuals did not come back to their old network. So the DeBintal staff are picking them up when they are released, and sometimes even when those people are suitable, they employ them in the DeBintal, because the DeBintal has a small business. They start as a chicken farm, but now they change it into a quail farm, because according to them, it is more profitable and the eggs are easily to sell. They're also providing training to the extra offenders. The interview also mentioned that they're providing training for shirt printing, such things. And the interesting thing is they're also providing guest house for the wives of the terror offenders, because many of the terrorist offenders' families are not from Java, and the main prison here are in Java. So people who came from Sumatra and other parts of the island in Indonesia, when they come to Java, they have the DeBintal provide a guest house, so the wife or the families can stay for a while when they visit their families in prisons. So in conclusion, based on the things that have been mentioned by my colleagues before, the online prevention in Facebook created backlash and threatening comments from the targeted audience, mainly the gulat from the camps of pro-ISIS supporters. The counter-narrative campaign in Facebook, sadly, is not really working. It's backlash strengthening the audience commitment back to their ideology in the group, rather than persuading or changing them. But according to the DeBintal, the audience that changed their belief usually is not the part that is the one that part of the unsure or the unstable group or the labil group that they call, not the fully radical one. And the in-prison de-radicalization and reintegration program shows more positive results. However, the intervention is not likely to be determining factors on such changes, because DeBintal were not, this activity is not consistent. They were called, the service will call on call basis. And the program, so we conclude that this program, the Credible Voice program is a very good, but it should not depend on Credible Voice alone. The Indonesian government mainly should have a training for the Indonesian government staff to have a sufficient skills in delivering and managing the programs as well. Yeah, I think that's all for me. If there is any input and comment, I'm very much welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And our final speaker, Dr. Vivian Gerrand, with the paper Drawing to Disrupt, Alternative Narratives to the Manosphere.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today and share my work with you. My paper is called Drawing to Disrupt, Alternative Narratives to the Manosphere, and it emerges out of a recent rapid evidence assessment completed for the AVERT network with colleagues Josh Roos and Chakran Ahmadzadeh. Content calling out everyday sexism on social media has grown in prominence in recent years through the work of feminist Instagram accounts such as the Equality Institute, Dis Bonjour Salaput, and Vulgar Drawings. And yet, for the most part, such accounts have had limited impact on the proliferation of materials associated with the so-called Manosphere, which uphold the narrative that men are victims of women's empowerment. Intersecting with colonial, far-right and white supremacist views, this content promotes traditionalist gender norms that eschew feminism and are imbued with misogyny, leading to threats and acts of violence against women. Efforts to mitigate the social influence of such movements through CVE, counter-narrative campaigns, or the removal of content from big tech platforms through deplatforming initiatives have limited efficacy. This is the case for at least 3 reasons. First, such content may simply be relocated to niche, unregulated environments on the dark web. Second, violent extremist groups may turn to analog means to conduct their recruitment processes offline. Finally, content-driven pull factor interventions will be inadequate if push factor underlying grievances that motivate radicalisation processes are not addressed. So the paper that I'm giving today is divided into a few different sections. I'll first define what I mean by alternative narrative and how it differs from the idea of counter-narrative. I'll go into some work around how we might measure their efficacy or understand their efficacy, because this is a bit of a lacuna in the field. And then I'll go into the role of drawing, particularly in this case of someone who's using drawing to effectively disrupt aspects of the insulosphere and support disengagement from it. I'll then finish by going around thinking about the idea of calling out, from calling out to calling in. So what is an alternative narrative? Our study found that alternative narrative interventions, which are under-researched and yet critical to addressing violent extremism and radicalisation, are different to counter-narratives. In contrast to counter-narratives, alternative narratives address root causes such as real and perceived grievances, as well as the psychosocial needs that may lead to engagement with extremist discourse. Alternative narratives have a significant role to play in sustainable redirection away from social harm and violent action. Our research found that effective alternative narratives directly address root causes, acknowledge the kernel of truth in much messaging, have, as we've heard in the previous session, credible messages and messengers, redirect rather than de-radicalizing, are context-specific, stand for rather than against something, tend to be grassroots rather than top-down. They empower, engaging the audience as active agents. They're not explicitly counter or preventing violent extremism. They complement and contribute to structural change. They involve things like sophisticated multimodal content, particularly online, representation practices, videos, memes, music, and online posts to convey alternative messages that crucially meet people where they're at. They work at the level, therefore, of effect and imagination, and they are often created or co-created with the target audience. They promote ambiguity and agonism or good conflict, critical for democracy. They inspire critical thinking. They happen on and offline. They may shift from us and them to we, and they move us from an either-or mentality to one that can be both and, targeting fence sitters, so not people at the extreme pointy end who are engaged in radical movements. Evidence in the field of terrorism studies, however, is limited on the efficacy of these narratives. Our assessment found that there's been little to no focus on how alternative narratives can be used to engage with the manosphere or incels. Bruce et al. Note that peers and family have been viewed as more important in shaping responses rather than institutions in this area. This form of extremism has failed to see official counter-narratives emerging, whether it be by governments or social media companies, to tackle the spread of misogynist hate. This paper, as I said before, builds on our recent rapid evidence assessment to understand how alternative narrative interventions might work in the manosphere, taking into account the work of feminist influencer account Vulgar Drawings or Lily O'Farrell within a framework of pro-social resilience. Popular feminist influencer and cartoonist Lily O'Farrell's memes about sexism began to engage with the nuances of the manosphere in 2021 when she decided to talk to young men who were trolling her Instagram account. O'Farrell has been posting memes calling out sexism since 2018. These men had become aware of her account after it was shared in a men's rights subreddit group. Concerned that the group was made up of young men predominantly aged 16 to 23, O'Farrell decided to investigate the movement by joining incel subreddit groups. And for those that aren't familiar with the term manosphere, I'm sure most here are, it's a host of social media pages, online blogs and forums that reject narratives of gender inequality and instead argue that men are the real victims who are oppressed by feminism. So Lily O'Farrell, sorry. I'll just go back a couple of slides, sorry. I'm not sure how to go back. Sorry, is it possible to?
Ben's disappeared.
Oh, okay, that's okay. So why is drawing, so Lily O'Farrell is a cartoonist and influencer, and her cartoons use drawing to communicate messaging that tends to be of the calling out nature. So her use of avatars actually is something she has in common with incel forums, which tend to rely heavily on avatars, and people on these forums do not reveal their true identities. Unlike other social media sites where the use of a personal photograph, like a profile picture, this is unheard of in incel forums and certainly uncommon on wider distribution forums like 4chan or Reddit. The connection between avatars and cartoon meme culture come from the deeply embedded iconography of early 2010s meme culture. I've considered such cultures on platforms such as incel.co, incelwiki, and they can also be found on incelmemefandom.com. Now, drawing's an interesting space, particularly online, because it takes us in a way to a different kind of technology and also a slower technology. A lot of the work that's being done in the space of comics-based research thinks about drawing as offering ludic opportunities that enable communication with a wider variety of non-expert publics. Narratives can be communicated at the heart, and the narratives are at the heart of comic technologies. The sequential nature of comics makes it ideal for presenting narratives and processes. Non-fiction comics tend to use a narrator character, frequently the author herself or himself, as a sort of tour guide or storyteller, tying concepts together into a narrative. Comics-based research, multimodality, blending of sequential and simultaneous communication, emphasis on a creative voice, offers powerful tools for scholarly inquiry. As an emerging field of practice, comics can help us interrogate our increasingly image-based modern world. Narrative methods' ability to tap into human process of co-creating meaning and the power of arts-based methods to engage people's emotion and empathy. I'll just go back 2 slides, please. Thanks. Just go, oh, sorry. Oh. So Lily O'Farrell produced a book following her engagement with the Insulosphere. She says the inspiration for my book came from getting to know my trolls. One particular conversation made me realise for the first time that we have the same problems. It was this 16-year-old boy from Indianapolis who messaged me to tell me to die in a fire. It was something really graphic and really aggressive. Then we started talking and we had some long discussions. It was quite exhausting and we left it at we'll agree to disagree. But then he came back 6 weeks later and messaged me to tell me he'd met a girl and it was becoming romantic, and he asked me how he should be a better man for her, which was so moving to me. That's what inspired the book. It was the realization that a lot of men who are angry at me are angry because they think women are to blame, but the fight is the same and we're on the same team. We just have to get them on board with that. So the cartoonist produced a series of meme drawings titled Everything I've Learned About Incels, which illuminates the dynamics of the phenomenon for her mostly feminist, almost 300,000 followers. Instead of demonizing incels, her drawings provide an anatomy of the movement that allows viewers insight into its logics. Like many non-fiction comics creators, O'Farrell embraces the inherently subjective nature of comic narratives and integrates herself as a character in her work. This is powerful as it allows her audience to see her vulnerability as a vulnerable human being. O'Farrell's memes are an example of an alternative narrative strategy that supports good conflict, cultivating, bonding, bridging, and linking social capital while encouraging a shift from us to them to we. The feminist influencers' work subvert male supremacy, recruitment, and engagement with violent misogynist content. In this sense, O'Farrell's Instagram meme-based alternative narrative strategy has the capacity to decolonize, depolarize, and encourage movement away from violence-based solutions to grievances towards pro-social, radical, and resilient action. Deploying strategies that effectively mimic and respond to incel culture and modes of interaction, Vulgar Drawings is successful in her depiction and interpretation of the cartoon and meme cultures and her understanding of the different categories and examples of memes and how they're used. This creates an important understanding bridge that shows potential radicals that care has been taken to properly understand their culture before commenting on it. She's successful also in acknowledging the societal circumstances that lead to the culture and fostering an us against the problem mentality that rightly admits that incels are also victims. By breaking down the memes and their meanings to people who are unfamiliar with them, O'Farrell is also recontextualizing how they would appear to incels, having them explained simply and clearly with the context of informing normies or people who are unfamiliar with incel experiences. Presenting these memes out of their usual context separates them from their usual meanings, showing them in the cold light of day, simultaneously educating normies while also providing a platform for normies to publicly respond to these memes. The final slide within O'Farrell's series poses the question of what to do about the phenomenon. It advises the cartoonist's followers to engage in radical empathy, to listen and challenge the assumptions put forward by adherents of the male supremacist movement. This empathetic analysis and call to arms has led to significant numbers of young men at risk of misogynist radicalisation interacting with O'Farrell, with one man sharing, as we saw earlier, that he'd left the movement and found intimacy with a partner after his direct messaging exchange with the artist. I want to go back to the idea of how we might measure efficacy by drawing on the brave measure of youth resilience to violent extremism, a study completed by Grossman et al. In 2017, which it measures the ways in which young people can be resilient to violent extremism and identifies particular traits such as cultural identity and connectedness, or bonding capital, bridging capital, linking capital, violence, attitudes towards violence, willingness to speak out against it, and the degree to which it's seen to confer status and respect. So when these are at play, we can understand, we can find a way of understanding how resilient a young person might be to violent extremism according to this measure. So applying this measure to particular forms of alternative narratives can give us a sense of the extent to which they may be effective in building resilience to violent extremism and therefore their efficacy. So thinking in terms of the cartoons, the ability to connect with the people on the Insulosphere through the bonding capital of drawing and cartoons, the ability to bridge, so a different perspective which comes into contact through that conversation exchange on direct messaging, building trust, so not demonizing the incel, but actually trying to understand the perspective, however difficult. And then the attitude towards violence, helping shift away from an us against them, and needing to eliminate women as enemy to actually women are victims too. And we're all part of this structure, which is oppressing us in different ways. and then obviously movement away from violence. And clearly this is not something that can be simply applied to anybody in the incelosphere. And as I said earlier, the alternative narratives found that these interventions tend to work best with people who are fence sitters. So they're not people that are all the way down one end of it. It's people that have some ambivalence still about their involvement. In addition to illuminating a disturbing trend, O'Farrell's drawings call people in within a context of calling out everyday misogyny. Digital anthropologists have established social networking sites can enable political agency and subversion. Through a multimodal content analysis, this paper has considered them as hosts of possible alternative narrative strategies that disrupt gender assumptions through empathetic engagement with young men at risk of violent misogynist radicalisation. Alternative narrative interventions could arguably be deployed to disarm the manosphere and support disengagement from violent extremist discourses. Unlike counter-narratives, alternative narratives can be more effective at challenging extremist narratives because they directly address real and perceived grievances, as well as the psychosocial needs that may lead to engagement with extremist discourse. And this idea, I want to finish on this idea of moving from calling out to calling in. So Loretta J. Ross, who is an anti-racist and an anti-hate activist, has talked about this idea as a way of shifting beyond some of the stalemates that we can see in these spaces. And she talks about the importance of calling people in. She also prefaces that by saying not everybody is in a position to exercise radical empathy. Not everybody is in a position to call in an incel, for example. So she also talks about a third option, which is calling on people to behave better, calling on people to do better. I like to think of alternative narratives as a form of calling in, as an attempt to understand and work with the root causes of hate and violence through listening and empathy. I believe they can generate shared understanding of the patriarchal systems and structures that oppress most of us, removing the focus from scapegoats. This understanding encourages a shift from us and them to we. As I said earlier, appropriate boundaries and resources are critical to do this work, as oppressions are unevenly distributed and the trauma is real. Thank you.
Okay, thanks to all our speakers. Questions? I'll just wait a moment while we get the Zoom speakers back. So you've got a minute or two to think about what your questions are before I take over. So I think there are some microphones circulating. So if we've got any hands. Okay, well, I had a question for Noor. You talked a little bit about master narratives and micro narratives.
Yes.
Two questions. One, could you talk a little bit more about the relationship between those two, but also whether there were specific micro narratives in the films that you're making that you were sort of encouraging people to, your participants to put forward?
Okay.
They were things that came up organically for them.
Okay, so the idea will be the reason why I divide a narrative into three. I just want to look at the relation between the three. The one that's recognizable and familiar, considered true among a specific community, we call it master narrative. But that master narrative within our study usually are grounded within Islamic histories or Quran or Hadith, basically religious text, or specific event within Islamic history that they believe could be true. Let's say the collapse of Ottoman Empire, 1924, considered the end of the humiliation of Muslims. So therefore, we need to revive again. So that's what we call it. What I call it as a master narrative. But then there is a group narrative, how the group reframe that specific history. And then the last one will be how individual, it is a subjective interpretation of a narrative that has been produced by the group. In the context of my programs, especially my interventions, I use a life history where I divided the film has 4 characters. The one is called Arif Tuban. Arif is a hybrid from JI which is online, offline type of recruitment, and also online, because he ran the chat room Al Busro, which is the jihadi chat. And this is another character, the guy named Hendro. Hendro is one of the key figures in DeBintal, where Unaesah and also Finesse has been talking about. And he used so both online and offline, and from ISIS supporter, his personal or his micro narrative is redemption and a sense of also transference of personal masculinity, because he used to be, he called himself as a preman or thug, a bad boys, like to running around, have to fight, and then one day he got an epiphany, I want to start new life, and then he bumped into a specific narrative, which is coming from recognizable narrative within Islam, coming from a specific group. So this is the personal narrative, a sense of acceptance, a sense of being hero, meet into the narrative produced by the group. The same with the film that I produced with Ika as the main character. The main narrative will be, the master narrative is the collapse of Ottoman Empire, which is the collapse of Islamic Caliphate. And then the group came up with a possible solution, which is an ISIS one, we need to revive. And then the group promised that by supporting ISIS, you will have a, like it will clear your sins. And then in the case of Ika represent or interpret the group narrative produced by ISIS in social media as a quick fix for his life. So this is what I'm trying to say, the connection between macro level, meso, and also micro, but through the narrative that the book has been produced.
Thanks so much. Questions from others in the room? Okay, well, I have more questions. Vivian, thanks so much. That was a really interesting paper. And I come from creative arts and communication schools, so really interesting to see this work. How this seemed like a sort of case study example. Were there similar things sort of happening in other kind of arts-based fields other than comics and drawing, or was that kind of the one that you focused on?
This particular paper is focusing on technology of drawing as a way of communicating with this particular. This particular paper is focusing on the case study of drawing. So this cartoonist and the unique possibility of connection through that, creating that bonding capital with the insular sphere through drawing. This is part of a broader study that is unfolding. So it's a work in progress, which is looking at other examples also in history of particular kinds of engagements with, for example, male supremacy by feminists. But I haven't looked in great depth at other examples, right, for this paper.
Got another one. Other questions, Michelle?
Besieged by microphones. My question is also for Vivian. So look, I mean, I'm intrigued by this work. I'm intrigued by what the cartoonists are doing that you've talked about. I'm also intrigued by your analysis. And I guess you've mentioned that radical empathy is not going to be an option for everybody. So I immediately started thinking about the confronting nature of trying to reach out to people who are expressing, a kind of deep hatred or animus, but and something that's antagonistic. So you mentioned agonism as healthy, constructive conflict essential to a democracy, and then you've got antagonism, which is all about hostility. So how are you seeing the shift from antagonism to agonism, and how do we know when we've crossed that threshold? That's really my question that's arising from some of this work.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't think that there's necessarily a formula. I think it is very much a context-specific thing that can occur and will not necessarily occur in every instance. But certainly in the case of this particular young person who was on the incel spectrum who I thoroughly engaged with, he displayed a shift from seeing women as the enemy to actually finding himself a romantic partner who was a woman. So clearly his worldview had shifted from one of antagonism to one of an appreciation for different worldviews, and also a sense in which perhaps women were not the enemy any longer, or he wouldn't have been able to take that step. So I think the shift from that kind of us and them thinking to the we is something that can happen, but as I said, it's not a guaranteed, and it is an under-researched, and there isn't enough, I guess, evidence of efficacy yet. We need to look more at these sorts of alternative narrative interventions to find where they're occurring, because I think they are occurring, and they're not, as I said earlier, in defining alternative narratives, they're not necessarily labelled as preventing and countering violent extremism. So thinking in terms of resilience, like they are out there, how can we build on them is the question. Thank you.
Thanks. I think I saw a hand over this way. No? Sure. Go on.
Again, semi-formulated kind of question. You really got me thinking, Vivian, as well. You know, and just I think how far advanced your kind of thinking is there compared to traditional ways of talking about whether it's alternative or counter, but the way of talking about narratives in CVE. Because so often, you know, we kind of think that the role of CVE in that space is kind of a strategic communications role, or it's about extremist propaganda is out there. We need to do our own propaganda and using the internet as a kind of broadcast platform to get messages out. But a narrative is not a message. You know, like, you know, you had your beautiful quote by Paul Klee that, you know, drawing is taking a line for a walk. Well, a narrative or a story is also something that takes you from place to place. And how we're trying to get someone from one place to another place, you know, through a narrative, I think is an interesting thing to think through as well. But what came out really clear in yours as well is that you're, again, similar to Sheikh Mustafa yesterday, you know, when he was talking through the lens a little bit of a contest of ideas, but what he was actually doing is building a relationship with people. And I think what your example does is the same thing. It's not simply a counter message or even an alternative message. It's opening a space for a relationship to start forming, and that woman, the cartoonist, was starting to actually develop particular relationships with 16-year-olds and things like that too. So it's more just an observation, or anything, if you want to reflect on that.
Yeah, thanks, Malcolm. I think that's a really critical point. The building of a relationship, the building of trust, which is something that's come up in almost every presentation I've heard so far, is critical to, I guess, finding a way from finding that movement from antagonism to agonism, finding a way to build trust across these difficult positions and lines is not an easy endeavour, and that's why I think the alternative narrative, and I say alternative narrative as a distinct from counter narrative, because I also want to, you know, that our study found it isn't just about the messaging, it's about what happens outside even the online space. What are the structural conditions that lead someone to become antagonistic to a particular group? How do we also address those things? So it's happening at multiple levels simultaneously to be effective.
This may be out of scope for your research, but I was wondering if you've looked at the effect of the women who are creating these comics or memes, or women who are engaging with them online as well, whether they have developed opinions that are, I would maybe anti-men or things like that, or whether they feel like kind of they have a responsibility as the potential victims of incels or violence to be rehabilitating men, even though they're the ones that are the victims possibly in this situation.
The accounts that I have considered for this study so far, most of them are focused on calling out behaviours that tend to be promoting gender inequality. So they're not as focused on things like calling in and perhaps as invested in doing work that is seeking to rehabilitate. I don't know that the ones that I've looked at other than O'Farrell have actually committed to doing that work. And I don't know that they feel that it should be something they do necessarily either, because it's a kind of work that requires a lot of energy and resources. And it's important to note that Lily O'Farrell had the support of a male friend who had done some research in this space, who had supported her to engage. So having appropriate resources is critical. It's not for everyone to go out and attempt to do it. It could be very traumatic. It could be counterproductive. So I think it's important to qualify this kind of, but I do think it's a very promising and hopeful intervention, which is the reason I've done this study. So.
Okay, I think we've got time for maybe one more short question. I'm not seeing hands up. So I have a question for you. Thanks. It sounded like at the end of your paper you had some reservations about the work DeBintal were doing, but we're also finding some positives in it. I wondered if you could speak a little bit to sort of where the organisation is themselves. Are they sort of looking at changing what they're doing, or is there a sort of move there, or are you just sort of evaluating at this point?
Right. Thank you very much for the question. I think we had some reservations, as explained by my colleague and me, I think, in the presentation, because what we observe from the online activities, it shows that with the things that they're doing in the online, some give some negative comments and backlash from the targeted audience that they plan. But when we had interview with the staff, they claim that actually it brings the result that they want, which is they got a lot of messages from say those supporters of ISIS who maybe not really sure whether they want to follow the ideology or not. But yeah, we haven't seen those messages, so I think that's the reason why we still have some sort of reservation. We want to know what kind of the conversation that they had with those claims that they made. So I think that's the reason why we had reservation first for the online activities that they have. And the second one is because the program is still pretty much on ad hoc basis, and really depends on this police call D88 to carry it or run their programs in prison and also reintegration programs.
Thanks so much. I don't see any other hands up in the room. So please join with me in thanking our speakers again. Thank you.